It's an idea of a passionate to help. A passion, I mean, it's a joy to people with a full of longing and full of life and happiness, every kind of thing. A rich emotional quality to an idea. And characteristically, of course, this only lasts about, the passion of it only lasts maybe 100, 200 years outside. But the idea that it can continue, can keep on. And it becomes more and more brittle and more fragile, more and more easily broken down and destroyed. And characteristically, it's been by various kinds of barbarians, but it's also been simply by its own weight. Almost certainly, the Egyptian world, a collapse of its own weight. It wore itself out. And once that happens, the idea never can fill anybody else with the same kind of emotion, with the same kind of pleasure, delight. And so the Egyptians, their passionate attachment to immortality prompted them, made them create extraordinary things that no one else ever had, such as the pyramids, such as the mummification of the body. When you consider that the body is the most, easily destroyed, fragile, delicate thing, and they were determined to make it last. And they were succeeded because they were so desperate to do it, you see, that they actually worked out a very elaborate system. It took, for a very fine mummification, it took, I think it was 11 months or something. It took a long time. And there was never no other people ever had that same kind of passion about it. Just not at all. And then of course, that amazing passion for ideal beauty. And no one else could ever feel that in the same way that the Greeks do. They couldn't, no one following has been able to. No matter how much they wanted, no matter how much they tried to. And the Romans, you see, when they came in, essentially as barbarians, they longed to be able to do that. They tried to do it. And they did their very best to do it, but they absolutely couldn't do it. They couldn't get that vision because it was gone. And then the idea lasted, of course, down to the present time. The idea of ideal beauty and the idea of how to achieve it kept on and right on, and actually being revived every maybe 200 years, certainly every 400 years, from the time of the 5th century. But no one was ever able, again, to feel the same kind of passionate attachment to it. And of course, exactly the same thing happens in the 13th, 12th, and 13th century. The joy that people felt when they had escaped what they expected was the end of the world, the year 1000. The joy and the sense of absolute overwhelming thankfulness, gratefulness, delight, and love. And the flooding of the country with those colleges and gave it that moment, and it really only lasts 100 years. It begins to be self-critical, it begins to exaggerate itself by the end of the 13th century, and then it is, of course, overcome by the Papal Schism and the Black Death, and everything lies in ruins. And that particular joy, that particular sense of an absolutely loving and gracious and endlessly merciful divinity watching out for you all the time. And the sense that now, not only had you been saved from being literally in hell by the end of the world. But you also had the sense of it of being a continuing love, a continuing delight. And of course, then they do things, because they felt this way, they did things no one else ever could do again. No one else had ever done before, and they built Shark's Cathedral, an absolutely joyous, bursting, up-moving vision in architecture that never had existed. And the way it was built, never, I mean, it's endless. People have never been able to even to believe, I mean, to understand in any way how people built Shark, just the size of it. Remember that it held 10,000 people. And that it was built by everybody, the whole society hitched themselves to carts to bring the stones to build it. And it was everything, the nobility and the peasants and everything. And they did it in silence. And then they would rest, they would sing and confess their sins and go on in silence, carrying these huge stones, in carts, harnessed like animals. Because they wanted to. I mean, if you've ever been in love, you know what happens. That is, there's nothing. I mean, what would you not do for the thing you love, for the person you love? And your delight in being able to do something that's difficult, and it's hard on you for the person that you love is one of the greatest joys in the world. And imagine when the whole society is in love with whatever it may be. And then when it's gone, it's just, it's really gone. And there's no bringing it back. And there's no way even that you can quite understand how it ever happened. It's a whole new thing has to come about. Now the latest one of these extraordinary moments occurs in the middle of the 18th century, what we call Romanticism. And is in its great power, again, a feeling of a new world. The world is made new, and everyone in it is made new. And the ideas catch hold and simply spread through the society. So that the idea, for instance, of nature as being really divine, of individuals as being much more important than society, infinitely more. And emotion, much more valuable than any kind of reasoning or thought. Now, you see, I know that all those ideas are familiar to you because you have all felt that. Most of us, we still live under the idea of Romanticism. Nothing has come to supplant it. The barbarians may. Where can they come from? But it is still the dominant idea. Now, of course, weakened. In the height of Romanticism, people come and they die of love. And I don't think that's happened lately. I mean, it really is, people aren't capable of it unless it's expected of them. And then you could just fade away. If your beloved died or if your beloved left you, you just faded away. You took to your bed and pretty soon you were dead. All for love. It was a very becoming way to die. You got thinner and thinner, paler and paler, and subsided deeper and deeper, and everybody watched and knew what you were doing. And it was, of course, a very handy and dramatic thing for people. And it was something, again, that all kinds of people could do. People in all walks of life could die of love, and did. I always like to tell people that there's a monument in the Oddfellows Cemetery here in Santa Cruz to a man who died for love. And it says that on it. He came, his beloved died, and he rode horseback in the middle of the night down to Capitola on the beach, rode back, rode to the cemetery, got off, and killed himself on her grave. Now, you know that's a wonderful thing. I always think Santa Cruz should be some way to I don't, maybe sanctified by love, but the least you can do if you're in love is go and find his grave to put flowers on. Those ideas still are active for us. And one of them was that emotion, feeling, and sensitivity were the greatest things that a human being could express or feel, and love itself. And the person who had this capacity was an elite person. He was a person above the world, above the rest of society, just by this marvelous sensitivity, this deep, passionate emotions. And they made him greater than any kind of nobility, you see, or any kind of wealth. He was selected above the society. And who has the greatest capacity for emotion and for feelings? The artist. So the artist becomes, under Romanticism, the absolute hero of the world. And of course that idea still persists, that the artist is a genius. And if it doesn't, the least artist is a genius because of his extraordinary capacity for responsiveness, for capacity of feeling and passion and so on, and for his capacity for suffering. So that the artist then becomes this extraordinary figure that many people still think of. But it's always, of course, now, because it's really only an idea, not something which is held passionately. Now people have the most awful difficulty deciding what an artist is. That is, ordinary people. I've myself been introduced to people as an artist, and it has a very damaging effect on the introduction. Because people don't know, you see, whether to respect you and consider that you're very splendid because elite and emotional life, or whether to think you're really maybe totally mad or just a no good. Because you've got exactly both of those images of the artist. The artist is somebody who's starving in a garret, which may be great for his suffering, but it's not great for his position in a society where starving in an attic is not thought of as either difficult or desirable. So the artist now suffers from this peculiar hangover of his heroic stature at the beginning of the 19th century. And if you don't know what the artist is, then of course you don't have an idea what art is. And again, art used to be thought of as something, first of all, that was elevating. And that's unfortunately exactly the reason why art is in the university. They thought that it had a civilizing and elevating effect. Well, that depends a great deal on the art. And it's not necessarily true of all art that it's going to be either civilizing or elevating. It may be exactly the opposite. But people are in a way, they can't judge them. They don't know how to judge them. Because part of what happens with Romanticism is that the whole burden of society is thrown on each person. Everybody has to, if you deny the power of society and point to the individual, then the individual has to bear the whole thing. He has to be able to make his own moral judgments, aesthetic judgments, economic judgments, every kind, judgments of happiness, whatever they are. Because the society doesn't provide them. And of course that's exactly the condition in which most people find themselves at the present time. And certainly it's the condition that the artist finds himself in. What is it that he is, and what is it that he does? And in our present time, this condition just increases and intensifies and doubles, and it's a tremendous duplication and doubling and tripling and quadrupling of the experience of not knowing what it is. Then in addition I think the artist at the present time has a terrible feeling of two things. One, if he is understood, that is, if he's liked and bought, he's very suspicious of that. Now, this is true of all of them. It's not just true of the ones that you know. It's true of all artists. And one of the things that a great many artists in the 20th century have done is try to prevent people from liking their work. They've tried to prevent people from being able to buy it, for instance. One of the great examples of that is a man whose work of art was to go into Central Park in New York and dig a hole in the ground about, I guess, 6 or 7 feet deep, not very large, but deep, and then fill it in. That's it. That was the work. Well, you can't show it to anybody. You can't exhibit it, so he's relieved from all the problems of galleries. Nobody can buy it. You see, it's a slap in the face to everything that in a way the artist has, the artist always in previous times, simply diligently worked to convey what it was that the society most valued. But if the society most values the uniqueness of the individual and the particular sensitivity of the individual that other people can't understand because they're not as sensitive, where is he? Is he absolutely isolated at all? And so then what happens? You see, either he becomes part of people in revolt against this, which doesn't do any good. See, that's the marvelous thing. The man who did the pole, whose name I, of course, totally forgotten, they kept on doing a lot of different poles. People began to photograph them, and they began to make sort of cost-accounting descriptions of what, how much the spade cost and how much the electric torch cost and so on, and then said this was it, and then you could buy these things. You could buy not the spade, that was still his, the cost of it. And so that the terrifying, strange, and mysterious thing, the passion people have to collect works of art, which aren't even visible. I had a great time once at an exhibit by a man named Yves Klein, who sold you what was essentially a gold brick. It was nothing, but he sold it to me. I didn't buy one, so I never did learn what was actually exchanged. You see, there couldn't really be anything exchanged. But let's look at some slides. I'll show you what all of this problem causes when you see works of art. And you get then the question, because there isn't any kind of uniform style, but there is something that we would call modern art. And if you look at both of these things, these paintings, most people would say the one on the right was a modern painting, and the one on the left is not a modern painting. The one on the left was painted in 1983, I think, and the one on the right was painted in 1970s. So they're both contemporary paintings. But why would people say that? First of all, because the one on the right has that kind of obvious picturesqueness rather than beauty, as it aims for something which is awkward or eye-catching or interesting, rather than something which is beautiful, that is harmonious, graceful, noble. All of those words you see now turn people off, as I said. People turn against those words. And they turn toward words like interesting, perplexing, harsh, difficult, all of those words seem words that would describe some work of art that you like. And harmonious, graceful, and so on would describe something which you didn't like. And essentially this comes directly, of course, from Romanticism, that suddenly was able to see that a dead tree was eye-catching, was fascinating, had a depth of emotion and feeling that a perfect living tree could never have. And a tree of perfectly symmetrical shape could never have. And we still carry that burden. It's almost impossible for us to see anything or to hear anything which is really harmonious. We turn away from it. We're frightened of it. We think of it as really alien to us and undesirable. And the fact that her position is awkward and hers is composed means that we're drawn to that one on the right and not to the one on the left. The one on the left represents and intends to represent the quality of harmonious repose. And we are almost totally incapable of either seeing or enjoying anything having to do either with harmony or repose. We're restless and inharmonic in almost everything we do and everything that we admire. Let's look at the next two. Both of these are called landscape. And of course you'd have no trouble deciding which was a modern painting. Again, they're painted at the same time. This one on the right, which is painted by a man who lives in Salinas named David Vigara. And it belongs to something which is outside of the mainstream. It is called allegorical landscape. The one on the left is called landscape with traffic signs. But there's a deliberate meaninglessness in the one on the right. And also you see that thing that you really have to remember the emperor's clothes. You have to remember that story because, of course, Hans Christian Andersen never wrote anything for children. He always wrote for grown people, and they called it for children. But the whole nature of it is totally unlike a fairy story. You remember, in the first place, that it's an emperor, and there's never been a fairy story in the world that had an emperor. An emperor is a modern thing to be. And they always had kings, and queens, and dukes, and princes, and all kinds of things, but never emperors. And the thing that the tailors threatened the people with, if they weren't sufficiently acute to see the emperor's clothes, and of course he had nothing on, was that they would lose their job. An absolutely modern thing. Nothing like a fairy story. That they would lose their job. They would be revealed to be unworthy of their job. And so, of course, they could see anything that you told them to. Ask them to. And they did. And then, of course, the wonderful thing is, in the end of the story, the child says the emperor has no clothes on, and everybody walked on, holding their heads higher than ever. Because, of course, the child's opinion wasn't worth it. Let's look at the next two. Now, both of these were painted at the same time, same year, in the late 70s. Now, let's look at the next two, because I want you to see how marvelously unlike things which were painted at the same time. And you see, usually, actually, time has a very deep mark on whatever we do. I learned once that a graphologist can tell the decade in which you learn to write by the way you write. And you have no idea. You think you're writing, of course, your writing is your own invention. It's absolutely your own invention. But it's marked for the time when you learn to write. And everything is marked by this time. But the mark in our time is so difficult to see, of course, because it's our time. And it allows for such tremendous range. Now, all the things that you're going to be looking at right now will be things that you could have seen if you'd gone to galleries in the last 10 years. Now, let's look at the next two. Now then, what are you supposed to say when you see them? It's almost impossible, I'd say it's absolutely impossible for human beings not to make some comment about whatever it is that they encounter. It's really impossible. The only way you can do it, of course, is to become enormously sophisticated, so that really nothing interests you at all. And you can keep from saying anything, like, what a bore, what's he think he's doing, or wasn't that a lousy movie? You haven't seen a movie until you've been able to say to somebody, wasn't that a lousy movie, or wasn't that marvelous, or didn't you love it, and so on. Because we really live to judge them. We can't help it. We do it all the time. And of course, so then you're confronted. Suppose you go to a gallery, and you could easily go and on this wall would be one thing, and on that wall would be the other. And then you would say, what's going on? What does this mean? Because one is trying to efface itself as completely as it can and almost succeeds. And the other is trying to zero in on you. I mean, make you have to look at it. And so what are you going to say? Isn't that beautiful or isn't that interesting? If there were a room full of these, would you find them interesting? Or either of them? No, until you'd be stumped, you'd have to say something else. But you wouldn't know what. You really wouldn't know what. And I tell you, nobody would know what. I mean, what you could do is say nothing in a very sophisticated way. And of course, mainly talk to the other people and exhibit them. Let's look at the next one. I don't want to spend too much time now. Both of these are painted at the same time. Now, all of the things that I'm showing you are the work of successful artists. And they have shows in New York, and they are written about, and their work costs thousands of dollars. And they are what you would call, and you can't avoid realizing, are successful painters. And that shows such an amazing, who's buying them? I mean, it's the same people. You see, we buy that one, and then also buy the one on the right. They're both derivative. One's derivative from the work of children, and one's derivative purely from advertising. Let's look at the next two. Another. Now, this is 1980, one on the left. One on the right is 1940. See, in some marvelous way, certain things persist, and not necessarily in the same artist, but in all kinds of different artists, they got things returned to these things. Let's look at the next thing. There's a nice contrast, too. The painter on the right, Danish novel, is the most successful painter in New York at the present time. He gets, $50,000, $60,000 for a painting. That's called Humpty Dumpty. One on the left, again, would leave you puzzled. You could certainly talk enough about the one on the right. But if you want simply to lose yourself in a painting, looking at it as you would, for instance, a moving light, so that you can meditate on it and you can escape, use it really as a tool of meditation. This was fine, one on the left. These are also by Schnabel, the same man that did the one on the right. And I show them to you because they are wonderful. They're one of the things which is very tempting to the artist at the present time because they're easy. That is gimmicks. He made his name, Schnabel did, by pasting broken plates on canvas. That's what those things that you see there are broken plates, china. You can make it out. You can see cups and saucers and so on. And over on the left is a painting painted on velvet. You see, both of those things are startling. And what an enormous advantage this is if there are as many artists as there are today, and they're just an incredible number. If there are as many galleries, if you don't believe me, if you haven't thought about it recently, get a copy of the New Yorker and read in that front part of the New Yorker simply about the openings of shows. And there are hundreds on the same night. Because of this, that somebody has a show in New York means nothing. Unless also he can get people to write about it. And certainly if you paste plates on an enormous canvas, these canvases are often, you should call them canvases, velvets as canvases, are 10 to 12 feet long. So you can't, in this sense, miss them. This is a big temptation. Let's look at the next slide of the author. One of the things that artists today gets annoyed at is the idea that people have that he's expressing himself or that he's original. These ideas belong to something which most contemporary artists are opposed to as an idea. And of course Warhol made this very evident with his soup cans, which he had silk screened by a silk screen company. So he never had to touch anything about it, you see. Another sculptor at the same time used to send to iron foundries and tell them to deliver a certain thing that he saw in their catalogs, like a piece of steel 5 feet by 3 feet, weighing, X tons, and have it delivered to the Museum of Modern Art. That was his work. Now you see, that's an amazing thing, because of course, if either you or I delivered even rather smaller or a larger chunk of steel from a foundry, we would get nowhere. And why is this, you see? It's because of the extravagant importance which is given to who did it. And it's exactly like a check. You see, a check is only as good as the signature. And if you have the kind of signature that can make a check for $2 million, you've got a lot of money in the bank. Now, how does the artist get that money in the bank? Is the thing. That enables him to sign the check, that is, to sign what is really a worthless piece of paper. And you know that you can write a check on a piece of toilet paper if you want it. You don't have to have a proper one at all. But it will be accepted if your signature is accepted. And it will not be accepted if it's on the grandest, most perfectly printed one with your name and address, but your name means nothing or means you don't have it in the bank. And the work of art is exactly in that state at the present time. So here's a silk screen of Warhol's friend Hoffman. And over on the left, another painting which was made at exactly the same time, and it took the painter 3 years to paint that picture on the right. same amount of money. And both of them could be bought by the same person. Let's look at the next two. This is one of my favorite pieces. The one on the right is a Xerox. But it's a thing that's part of a show. The one on the left is a monumental, difficult thing made of metal. You wouldn't know whether to call it a piece of sculpture or a painting. It's called, he calls it a painting. But it's made of metal and a whole variety of medium. And it, of course, it looks so much like the watch, and it's wonderful. One of the latest successes in New York was given to a woman who bought Walker Evans photographs and signed her name to them and exhibited them as a show. Now, this was very successful. If there hadn't been Walker Evans photographs, people wouldn't have known whose photographs they were. You see, so she used photographs that everybody knew. It was from the Depression and all of us, perfectly familiar photographs. But she signed her own name to them, framed them and signed her own name. And she's gone on to cut pictures out of books like Turner's and Rembrandt's and sign her name to them. And this is very successful. Her show was sold out. And she had, furthermore, she then started on a great career, and it was given a name, and that's, of course, very valuable. It's called acquisitionism. And now a whole lot of other people are doing it. You see, because it's well, you can see why. Let's look at the next one. The sculpture is, in a sense, in just as bad, if not worse condition, in terms of what is allowable, what is used, how much you are supposed to contribute to the thing. If you are a person of enormous sensitivity and depth of imagination and profundity of all kinds of aesthetic gifts, anything you look at is marvelous. Somebody asked one of the painters of the 18th century, what do you do about ugly things? And he said, I've never seen anything ugly. Now, if you have that gift, then you will be pleased by either of these two shows. They don't run together. One of them is lights at the bottom. That's all, that's it. And the other is a tape around the wall. What you see there is tape, the little ink on it going around the wall. Now that would be hard to collect too, wouldn't it? It'd be hard to sell. Let's look at the next one. These are both by the same person. I'm not going to tell you anything. That's called felt corner. F-E-L-T, felt corner, because that's a piece of felt and it's sitting in the corner. And so it's titled as felt corner. On the left, you have the title is Fat Room with 100 disconnected posts. Parts of posts. That's about it. You're looking at the show right now. Let's look at the next one. There's another. This is both by the same person. I don't know whether you call it painting or sculpture. It's called sculpture because it's nothing else in the room and it's on the floor. When it's called period sculpture, I don't know whether you be sure that was sculpture or period. You know, this is very puzzling to people who are trying to teach art. Let's look at the next. How about a whole art department which realizes that somebody through acquisitionism is making a large fortune. Now you see, but things can be very complicated. They can be absolutely bare nothing, as the things you just saw, which are chalk marks on the floor, or they can be extremely complicated. And this over here, this is a whole scene, an elaborate, very carefully created scene. And the one on the right is a chair made to call Mother. Complicated, difficult things to do. Let's look at the next one. Sometimes they're just intended to look awkward and undesirable, such as this dead rat here. It's just fur made around plaster to look like this now. And the one over on the right, of course, really, you would not know if it weren't in a gallery. So you have to assume that these things have a greater authority by being in a building where it says art over the door. Let's look at the next. You can have, you see, a terrible dread of any kind of skill. And it's perfectly natural in our society to have that dread. Because the skills have been so destructive and so difficult and have made our lives so complex and so in many ways painful that you can actually be against any kind of skill. And you can also then really make something which is pretentious. The title of the one on the left is The World. And the one on the right is Plastic Objects. Let's look at the next. See, one of the ways in which you can give things a kind of artificial preciousness is simply by setting them up that way. So that you make them look as though they are immensely valuable by the care in which they are set in place and with which you look at them. So that the one on the right are two nails on a piece of velvet. And that, of course, gives it a kind of majestic presence which they really maybe don't deserve. And the same thing is happening over here by another artist entirely. Let's look at the next. Now I have a series of these to show you which always fascinate me, and I never can get over people's fondness for it. But it is a plank leaning against a wall, a piece of board, or sometimes quite tall, sometimes several boards. But the ones I'm going to show you none of them are done by the same person. These are all different people, but it's exactly the same thing. It's boards leaning against a wall. And they can be painted or they can be not painted. Let's look at the next one. That one has neon to help it. That one is enormous. You can see that the door looks like a mouse hole. And the one over on the right has got a little shift toward each other. But they're still, that's what they are, boards propped up. Let's look at the next one. There's a kind of ghost of a board over on the right. And on the left, you have one of the original boards. This was made in 1918. Let's look at the next. Now, one of the most amazing phenomena of this particular period that we're talking about is the work of Roy Lichtenstein, who has made a name for himself and a very successful career out of making fun of all modern art. Over on the right, the title of that is Modern Picture. And what he's done is he makes things which anybody would immediately recognize as modern art, you see, because that's exactly what it is. But he makes it out of peculiar materials. And he makes it out of beignet dots, the kind that commercial artists and cartoonists use, which are just patterns of dots that you apply to things. And he makes it deliberately, it's a deliberate parody of it. And of course he parodies the whole scene by painting such a thing as this. I can see the whole room and there's nobody in it. And that is what he has done, is take something from a comic book. I mean, from perfectly, he was the first person to do this. And simply enlarge it. This picture is very large. It's larger than that reproduction on the screen. And imagine how marvelously ironic it is, you know, to be hanging in a gallery, and the man saying, there's not a single person in this room saying that. And Roy Lichtenstein is one of the wittiest and one of the brightest people that I've ever seen. Mockery of what is, for the most part, contemporary art. And he's had great success with it. It's a very curious thing, you see, because he's really making fun of the very people who are buying his work. Let's look at the next two. I've noticed these. This is a modern Cubist painting over here. And he takes all the things that the Cubists use. You know, they use cards and the guitar and newspapers and sheets of music. And what he's saying is that these things become icons of this particular style. And what actually is happening since the beginning, you see, of Cubism is that it has become something which is stylish, which is not a style, but is stylish. And there's a very deep difference, you see, between those two. The quality of style really isn't continuing because it's so much the work of one person. It's so much the sensitivity and the romantic, the whole romantic scheme. It's the sensitivity and the emotional depth of one person which makes the painting. And then people who make it after that are simply being stylish. And that's exactly what Roy is saying. And he takes the subject matter of Matisse over on the right, but he turns it into this strange comic book style. Let's look at the next one. And one of the most delightful is a triptych, 3 pictures called Cow Becoming Abstract. Over here is the cow, also with those marvelous mad stripes. And there's the next picture. You can scarcely make out the cow. And let's look at the next two. And there's the very last cow over on the right. And what he's saying is that this is also just a matter of something which is stylish. That the exploration and the effort and the depth of feeling that went into the beginning of Cubism is simply evaporated. It now has become, and it became that by 1919. That is the anguish of Cubism. It's one of the 2 most anguishing ways that you can possibly paint, because Cubism aims to paint anything that it paints from all different angles in the same painting on top of each other. And of course this is very laborious and very difficult. And when it becomes something which is just stylish, it's very easy and quite delightful, but it is purely decorative. It becomes then something which is, in this sense, absolutely decorative. And over here on the right, this is called Portrait on the left. See, it's called Portrait of Madame Cézanne. And of course what he's doing there is making fun of people who think that the meaning and the nature of art and the value of it and anything else about it has to do with its purely formal character. And there is book which is published on Cézanne that's full of pictures just like this, which are not being parodied. I mean, they're not a parody. And in fact, the man who wrote that book was had so great a sense of humor and so delicate an ego that he sued Roy Lichtenstein for painting that picture. And of course, it's just a marvelous illustration of the pedestrian heaviness of his mind, that he would imagine that this is what the painting is about. And when Roy uses exactly the same thing, of course, he simply is revealing the absurdity of it. And this is simply not what matters about a painting. Anybody, Cézanne's or anybody. Let's look at the next one. Of course, the facade of Rouen Cathedral, painted day to day by the Impressionists, and now you see he turns it also into that extraordinary, immaterial, fluctuating image, but he does it with all those dots instead, on a photograph. And of course, you recognize this as Mondrian, which is not Mondrian, but it's Roy Lichtenstein having fun. Let's look at the next one. And of course, these are even more recent criticisms. I think the one on the left, you see, is a criticism of the absolutely boring quality of a great deal of art. It's not only that it's not elevating and not spiritually very exhilarating, but it's just downright boring. And that's something which is one of the peculiar tastes of the contemporary mind, of the contemporary sensitivity, is wanting to be bored, wanting a mechanical, boring thing. And of course, you see it in rock and roll with making machine drummers, having a machine do the drumming instead of a person. You see it also in people like various musicians, John Cage among them, who simply make something as deliberately boring as possible. Making three notes played 450 times without any break. What is that for? It's on the assumption which the person knows is not true. That you have such aesthetic depth, you see, that you cannot exhaust three notes ever. They're so sensitive and they're so attuned and they're so, so absolutely extraordinary, and that the 400th time you think, oh, it's over. Everybody knows it's not true. Everybody knows that this is absolutely boring. Let's look at the next one. And hold that one on the right just a moment. Because this is the back of a picture. It's called a picture of a stretcher bar. The stretcher bars that and what you have is the back of the picture. That's the Game Boy making fun of everybody and making fun of himself and making fun of the whole scene. And over here, of course, it could be in anybody's Sears Roebuck catalog in the olden days, just to has a nostalgic quality. Let's look at the next two as a game. The next. Over on the right, you have tension. It's called tension, stress. And it's not just making fun of the artist, but and that continuous use of the word tension and stress, but of people's feeling that this is something which they want to experience in art. They want that kind of anguish. Let's look at the one on the right. When you see Freud, of course, you get a very Lichtenstein's work. You get a very strong sense of having a kind of little survey of art of the last 40 years at least. And sometimes you get that in somebody's own work. And I'd like to show you this man's work, because anybody looking at this, you don't know his name, I bet you anything. I didn't know his name till I found these things. I'll tell you just so prove that you don't know it. It's Moynihan, you know, like our friend. And when you look at this, you know perfectly well that the one on the left was painted in the 50s. Abstract Expressionism. It was in the 50s, and he painted an abstract expressionist painting. By the 60s and the 70s, early 70s, that was over. So he paints the one on the right. That's much more, you see, that's right with it for the 60s and 70s. Let's look at the next two. And look what he does in the 80s. Same man. 10 or 15 years apart. Absolutely meticulous photographic realism. Let's look at the next one. Another person who goes through certain phases of fashion. Over on the left, you have something from the 60s. See that same hard color that you saw in the one by Moynihan. And over on the right, what he does in the 80s. Leda and the Swan. And you see, you would never know if I hadn't told you that this was painted by the same person. You'd have no way of having the least suspicion. So what becomes of the idea that the artist is expressing himself? What becomes of the idea that he has a style which you recognize? So that you know that this looks like Rembrandt or somebody who was studying with him, working with him, forging him. But it looks like him. Now, there's none of that fault. There's no reflection of the same person in both of these things. And let's look at another example where you have the same thing happening. Over on the right, the 50s. Over on the left, the 40s. And a complicated, extraordinary, nostalgic, romantic painting. And over on the right, what happens, all of that's washed away. You see, all of it is removed. And that lasts to the 70s. Now let's look at the next two. All this is by the same person. And you would never know it. You would never know it. And what's he doing now? You see, he's doing an entirely different thing. Moving to something which is like cartooning, which is like some kind of a deliberate abandonment of any kind of skill, of any appearance of skill. Let's look at the next one. Oh, the one on the right is wrong. And what is the artist ever going to do in that situation? Well, there's almost only one thing he can do, which is ignore it. He must instead find some way to be really, well, what happens, he has to have exactly the same thing happen to him that happens to a civilization. He has to become possessed passionately by an idea. And it has to be both a passion and an idea. And it may be something, because of course, it's perfectly possible for it to be something very small and very unimportant, or it can be something very large. It can be the person himself. It can be that kind of private world that you see in both of these paintings. Now, I have to remind you again that no painting ever can be reproduced. And if it is a very good painting, it is reproduced very badly. There's no other way. But it's absolutely impossible to reproduce any work of art. And when I show you these, you can only half grasp, as you can certainly see, the pleasant color, the mysterious quality. This woman with a snake kite over here on the left. and the tiger goddess over on the right. So exquisitely painted that the head of the tiger is transparent on the scarf that she has. You can't see that, of course, in the reproduction. And the tiger himself lying back under the tree. Let's look at the next two. This is called Passion, over on the left. Over on the right, Eve burning the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The painter is an unknown painter, a young woman working here in Santa Cruz, Teresa Ellis. Let's look at the next two. Another absolutely extraordinary painter who is herself has been given a vision and a wit and a richness of nature out of which she paints, and has been painting in what is absolutely her own style for 40 years. Over on the right, you have a self-portrait with a skull. And over on the left, another self-portrait, Paul. Her name is Joyce Treeman, and she is the most successful artist, one of the most successful artists in the country. And this is extraordinary, you see, because she's not known. And she's not known because she doesn't fit in a category. You can't say, she doesn't fit in a fashion, she's not stylish. She simply paints extraordinary paintings. And therefore, some people find her. And they buy them. She never has anything at home. And this has been true ever since she became a professional painter. And there's always a sense that you are in direct contact with an intelligence and a passionate nature and an extraordinary gift of painting. And you can't see any picture without words without having that response. Let's look at the next two. Sometimes they're very funny. They have a kind of Irish or wry quality. I think the one over on the right, a marvelous gesture, that again is self-portrait, both of these. Here she's leaning against. But the one on the right, well, maybe both of them, are marvelous essays about the relation between men and women. That gesture of kind of extraordinary despair, while the man goes sailing off, it's something that is really quite marvelously evocative and sharp and clearly seen, and almost any woman would understand it immediately. I don't think belabor it. But over on the left, the title is A Stranger and the Baroque and Me. And that whole great Baroque sky, you see, behind her. And so she has a thing which a modern painter has to have, can't help having, even if they don't want to, which is a knowledge of the whole history of art. They know what lies behind. And then what are they going to do with it? See, like Roy, they may take it as their subject matter and turn it into an enormous joke because of his feelings of it. Or they may take it in terms of something which they stem from. They actually hold on to something in the past. A lot of people, of course, try it as some of the sculpture that you saw, tried to be a fetish, tried to have the kind of magical power that an idol or a fetish has for very primitive people. And of course you can't do it, you see. It's not possible. Let's look at the next two. She has, with that knowledge of, she's painted a series of paintings that she's also very prolific. A series of paintings about painting. Over on the right, she's sitting in the foreground. It's myself at Eaton's studio exactly like Eaton's paintings, the American painter of the 19th century. And then all the people around, of course, are absolutely modern people. And it has that kind of wonderful wit, and it has that a whole sense of irony and the sense of the condition that we live in. We're living now in the 20th century. This is our condition. That we know about these things, but it also has an extraordinary quality of painting. The quality of paint itself is marvelous. And even here, this is Lautrec. This is called the large Lautrec. She's about to pull it down. And there she is over on the left. And there's Lautrec standing there with her. And let's look at the next two. She made a number of these, but she also makes paintings of very deep seriousness. And they are extremely difficult to reproduce. The one on the right is a very large painting, larger than the image that you see there, and it's Hercules and the lion. And if you look at it, you'll see the lion's head at the top, and the extraordinary head of Hercules, which is really quite like the Zeus Poseidon head. If you remember that wonderful figure of the Greek bronze with the Zeus Poseidon. And the whole feeling is of such a power and such a kind of joyful, brutal power that it's an amazing picture to stand in front of. It has such energy, such a core of energy, and such a marvelous manipulation of paint, the color, and the movement of paint. And over on the left, even more remarkable, it's a painting pointing to corpses, great furniture of the 20th century, a stack of corpses. The woman is pointing to them, and a cynical figure stands beside her in a plumed hat. It has something to do with the Holocaust, but it has also to do with all of the cruelty, all of the violence, all of the hatred, and all of the profound immorality of the world. And the figure of the woman is pointing, and is relentlessly pointing to this kind of terror in the 20th century. Let's look at the next two. There's another. There she is with Bonan. Two pictures of her, one of them standing up, and her mother is sitting in the chair next to Bonan. And of course the painting is like Bonan, playfully like. And then over on the left, an allegorical scene of the end of the world. The child sits with a skeleton, and the skull of a horse comes up. Let's look at the next one. Having that kind of passionate attachment to an idea, or having that fleshing out of an idea with passion and delight, is the greatest gift that the artist can possibly have. Because we do share it, you see. When we see it, we do share it. And it makes all of that foolishness that we saw really doubly foolish and pointless. And this is the work of a young man who is moved by California, a wonderful and familiar thing, and by the beach. And over on the right, you have this marvelous beach scene with all the quality of the brightness and the transiency, and yet it has a structure that moves you with those wonderful bright tints, moves you, giving to it almost a columnar quality of the stability of this very scene that seems so passing. And over on the left is delightful variation on people doing impossibly funny things on the beach, which of course they do if you watch them. Let's look at the next two. They have, there's a pleasant tension between the quality, a monumental quality, a quality of the stability or endlessness or really universal or Catholic quality in something which is so transient, so temporary, something which really, depends on weather, and depends on place, and depends on youth and agility and all these things, and yet it has a sobriety, even with those bright colors. The figures endure. The figures have that kind of power and endurance. Let's look at the next two. And he has the pleasure of making puns on things like Leger and Picasso. But in his own work, there is said an extraordinary kind of dignity. And you see, that's very difficult. And it's a marvelous thing to have to be able to create that. Something, two men carrying beach balls along a beach on a wonderful sunny day. You see, it's absolutely, it's a classical idea rather than a romantic idea. But it's also, of course, romantic. But it's by the very structure of it, by the processional way that they walk, carrying these huge things, it becomes something which is much more than that. Let's look at the next one over. There's a parody of Picasso turning the figures of Picasso of the 20s into people who live in Santa Cruz. And they are doing the kind of thing that you see on the beach, but they're turned into Picasso figures. And over on the right, there is another aspect, and let's look at the one on the left too. The one on the left changed. The one on the right, and the one on the left have an entirely different quality of some kind of warmth and depth and tenderness. There's nothing ever brutal or harsh in anything that John Weeby does. He is again a painter who is unknown and a painter who lives here in Santa Cruz. But he has this a range of expression within the style, so that when you see one, you know that that's who did it. I mean, there's the mark of his nature, the mark of his talent, and the mark of his ability on everything that he does. It's a very, it's something which is, of course, first of all, a matter of grace. It's a matter that grace descended, that this person had this passion and had this gift. And there's no way that you can either predict that or control it or even train it. It just is. And when the person has that, the joy of exercising it gives us joy. And the energy which that means, because there's an enormous generation of energy when that quality of the idea and the passionately held idea, the mind and the heart join to say the same thing. That is one of the most powerful generators of energy. Neither the heart nor the mind can possibly generate the energy that they can when they combine. But there's no way to make them combine. They combine if they combine through grace. Thank you very much.